As you've probably figured out, this is a sermon about the theology of ropes. Ropes held tightly, ropes pulled on or pulled against. We all have ropes. Some we hold on to all the time, some we pick up or grab onto when we need to, some that we struggle to let go of. When I think of the end of my rope, as I said to the children, the first image that comes to mind is from Beetle Bailey. How many times has Sarge been hanging over the edge of a cliff, holding onto a branch and looking up, hoping that he can actually be rescued by somebody as clueless as Zero or as lackadaisical as Beetle? The expression, "I'm at the end of my rope," usually means that I'm hanging on for dear life and I'm afraid of falling into the abyss. But there's two metaphors in the rope I want to talk about today. One's that vertical rope, which we'll come to in a little bit. The rope that I'm more interested in today is the horizontal rope, the tug-of-war rope, the tension between two opposing teams or two opposing views. We often have a sense that in our struggles, whether the conflict is about justice or fairness or rights or responsibilities, that all the right is on one side and all the wrong is on the other. That's never completely true, although there's some places that come close. The battle against apartheid in South Africa, the battles for civil rights and gay rights in the United States are examples that come to mind. But today, I don't want to focus so much on where each side is standing and more on the rope, the tug, the tension when two different, but at least partly valid ways of experiencing the world are on the opposite ends of the rope. This metaphor, holding up the other end of my rope, came into being for me when I was in seminary. I was taking systematic theology in the fall of 2001. Ironically, during that class, the attack on the World Trade Center took place, which was certainly arose from a tug of war between two very different views of the world. Systematic theology is a challenge for anyone, but it's a particular challenge for a Unitarian Universalist. It's the essence of the Christian belief system. It's kind of a catechism for intellectuals. I like the systematic part, the theology, not so much. What made it worse is that each of the three classes offered that semester picked 4 theologians to study in depth. And I did not adequately research my options. I just knew that I wanted to take this 9:30 class on Tuesday and Thursday, so if I took the systematic theology class before it, I could get it all in at once and go home, since it was a long drive to Atlanta. So I picked the 8 o'clock class. I would leave at 5 o'clock and frequently be late for class because you get right into rush hour traffic. And then I would dash into class. And to make things worse, in our particular class, one of the theologians on the menu was Karl Barth. Now, in case you haven't heard of Karl Barth, he was a mid-20th century German, of course, theologian, and he was the hero of neo-orthodoxy. It was a reaction to the excessive optimism of the people of the social gospel, the religious left, the kinds of Christians we recognize as our theological relatives, the ones who are hard at work trying to help God build his kingdom on earth. So needless to say, I took an instant dislike to Karl Barth. Actually, truth be told, I knew I disliked him before I ever went to class. His God was totally other. The gulf between God and man was so huge that only God could cross it, and God had to do that through Jesus. My God, I realize many of you may not have a God, but I do. My God is omnipresent in the here and now. He or she is neither omniscient nor omnipotent, but more the soul of the universe with whom we co-create our world. That's the God of process theology. It's also a view that is totally at odds with the understanding of Karl Barth. So one day in systematic theology class, we were working in small groups, and the TA was a very nice young man. He was a PhD student, Roman Catholic, and he said, I said something I didn't like about Karl Barth, and he said, "Can't you find something nice to say about Karl Barth?" And I thought for a minute, I said, "He's holding up the other end of my rope." Now, I never realized how useful that metaphor was until I found myself using it over and over. And then I passed it on last year to my ethics class, and they liked it. They used it to explain how they related to a philosopher with whom they disagreed. Usually the person at their end of rope was, at the other end of their rope was either Peter Singer, who's best known for the animal rights issue, or Immanuel Kant, the stern, somewhat humorless advocate of doing your duty and sticking to the rules and make sure you're doing the right thing for the right reason. That didn't resonate with them. But there's other pairs, environmentalists and loggers, vegans and owners of pig farms, religious liberals and fundamentalists, tea partiers and occupiers. They're all holding up the end of each other's rope. And, of course, there's lots of spectators, because tug of war is really fun to watch, especially if it's a muddy day like today. It would be really fun to watch. So spectators are cheering on one side or the other, or maybe looking at the rope and thinking, hey, that's my place on the rope, not at the far end, but near that end, and maybe I can pull things in the right direction. You can hold on to the rope in the middle as well as at the end, trying to tug the world in your direction. There's more to this metaphor of rope than just disagreement and tension. There's the person or the group of persons at the other end. And then there's the length and the breadth of the rope itself. Obviously, the length of the rope is how far apart are we? What's the distance between my way of being in the world and that person's way of being in the world? In case of Karl Barth, it probably goes all the way from here to Germany. But it represents how differently the other person perceives the question or the issue or the world. And the breadth of the rope is the multiple ideas that are kind of linked together to form a worldview, which somehow ties your position on abortion rights and gun control and capital punishment into a tightly braided package. Archimedes once said, "Give me a place to stand and a lever, and I can move the world." The end of the rope can become your place to stand, and perhaps if we pull at the rope, hoping the other side will give way, we feel like we're moving the world. But there's a less aggressive way of thinking about the other end of the rope, and this also goes back to a seminary experience in a different class. We had a Methodist professor visit our class, and she urged each of us to go deeply into a different religious tradition, one that might be at the other end of our theological rope. She herself had spent time in an ashram in India, learning to think and worship and pray as a Hindu, not because she wanted to abandon her Christian faith, but because she wanted to view it and understand it from a different place. That's Archimedes' place to stand. She still has a statue of Kali on her kitchen windowsill and practices aspects of the Hindu way, including yoga, but she didn't adopt reincarnation or other aspects of Hinduism into her theology, including its idea of accepting your station or stage in life and doing the best you can within that confined space rather than protesting against what seems like an unjust system. That's far she wasn't able to go. Hinduism is a rich religious and philosophical tradition that has much to teach us about how to live, teachings that we can incorporate and adapt into our Western religious understanding, whether Christian or Unitarian Universalist or anything else. John Kabat-Zinn, in his book, Wherever You Go, There You Are, claims that every newborn baby that drops into our lives is a Buddha, an enlightened one, a teacher from whom we can learn much wisdom. Well, one of my students was a new dad, and so his weekly reflection papers in political economy invariably incorporated some of the lessons about new parenthood, including things like choosing between cloth and paper and disposable diapers. I have to agree, I learned a lot from my 3 daughters, and I'm still learning from my 4 granddaughters. But I know that I can also learn from the person or the idea or the group at the other end of the rope. It's not just an enemy. Maybe it's not an enemy at all, but a teacher of what life looks like from a different vantage point, like what Christianity looks like from inside an ashram. And standing in one place, tugging away, is not likely to result in that kind of change in perspective, as long as you're focused on the rope and not the person with inherent worth and dignity in the ideas and causes and actions they support, who's at the other end of your rope. In fact, I learned a lot from that particular student, the new dad, because on the first day of class, he proudly proclaimed that he was a libertarian. And he continued to do that through that class and also through the ethics class he took the next semester. Now, you probably know there's a pretty strong libertarian streak in Unitarian Universalism. You've probably noticed that. Pretty individualistic. Sometimes it's in tension with our commitment to social justice. And of course, as an economist, there's also a very strong libertarian streak in mainstream economics that I think presents something of a challenge to creating and sustaining meaningful community. So, I'm not a libertarian. But like Jonathan, I sometimes find it handy to label myself, so when I need a label, I do this cautiously in South Carolina, I generally call myself a liberal, and sometimes a communitarian. I do not do that with the General Assembly when I testify, I should add. And yet, I don't support a libertarian view of gun control, but I do support a libertarian view of a woman's right to choose, and of civil rights for gays and lesbians. So there is a libertarian in there on certain issues and not on others. Perhaps like economist James Buchanan in his younger days, and our own Riley Stevens, I'm a libertarian socialist. I don't know if Riley still is, but he told me a few years ago he was. So as Jonathan and I and the class worked through some complex issues in political economy and in ethics, we began to appreciate some of the nuances and the complexities of both our own views and those of the person who was supposedly holding up the other end of our rope. Jonathan and I have just finished our third class together, directed readings in public finance, and I'm directing his dissertation covertly. I'm retired. Somebody else has to sign the chair's name. He calls me his mentor, but the mentoring's definitely been a two-way street. I did finally learn some important things from Karl Barth as well. Long after my systematic theology class a year or so ago, I was reading a biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And if that name doesn't ring a bell with you, Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran minister and theologian during the first half of the 20th century. He was the leader of the Confession Church, which was the anti-Nazi wing of the German Lutheran Church. He took part in a plot to kill Hitler, was sent to a concentration camp, and was executed just 2 weeks before his camp was liberated by the Allies. So during my Lutheran years, I became a fan of both Bonhoeffer and Tillich, just as I became a fan of James Luther Adams when I became a UU. James Luther Adams was the most influential Unitarian theologian and teacher of the 20th century, which is one reason why I chose his responsive reading. I think if I passed through all the denominations, I would probably have a favorite theologian from each one, but I'm pretty sure if I spent some time as a Presbyterian, I would not become a member of the Karl Barth fan club. Anyway, one thing I learned from the Bonhoeffer biography was how much his theology had in common with Karl Barth. So I had to rethink Karl Barth. What can I learn from Karl Barth? Well, there's a fair amount of humility in thinking of God as Barth does. Unapproachable, unreachable, totally other. We, as Unitarian Universalists, embrace many of the classical and Christian virtues: love, hope, compassion, justice, courage. But humility, which is a fundamental Christian virtue, is not a big part of our package. It's that lack of humility that was the focal point of Barth's attack on the optimistic, progressive, man can create the kingdom of God on earth kind of theology that's our stock and trade. Now, when you pair Barth's theology with the experience of Hitler and the Holocaust, the truly evil side of humanity, it has to give even the most firmly optimistic humanist pause. There's just something to be learned from those at the other end of the rope, just as there is something we can teach about hope and engagement from our end. That doesn't mean I embrace Barth's theology. It does mean, like the Candler professor who went to the ashram doing richer Christian theology, I learned from Barth some ways to enlarge or modify my own religious understanding. I'm kind of at the Occupy end of the Occupy Tea Party rope. But I can learn from the Tea Party to understand how they feel about certain things, about the arrogance of the intellectual class to which I belong, about the self-righteousness of so many of us on the left, about our equal ability on both sides to minimize the flaws of our leaders and magnify the flaws on the other side. In the last few years, I have actually become friends with a Tea Partier, and we have been delighted to discover how much common ground we have on certain issues, as well as acknowledging and affirming our differences. One of our common grounds is we think the South Carolina legislature is kind of out to lunch. And we would like to have a better legislature. Now, she doesn't necessarily want to vote for the same people as I do, but she'd like a better legislature, and so would I. So not only every baby, but every person at the other end of the rope is someone who can teach us and someone who can learn from us. As a lifelong teacher and learner, as a board member of Clemson's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, being alive means teaching and learning all the time. Good teaching requires humility, the recognition that you do not know everything, that you can make mistakes and you can learn from your students. Being willing to learn begins with the acknowledgement that you don't know everything and that others have something they can teach you. So humility is essential to being willing to learn. When we drafted a congregational covenant in 1999, there was one phrase at the end that I especially treasured, one that we struggled to craft, and one that has definitely had the footprints of our former member Paul Klipp on it. It read, "We celebrate the shared values that unite us and the differences that both challenge and enrich us." So a rope of shared values connects us in community, even as the rope also represents the tensions that arise from different ways of being in the world. If my horizontal rope is about both the shared values and the clash of ideas in human community, the vertical dimension of the rope also has multiple meanings. One interpretation of a vertical rope is our connection to the sacred. Another meaning is interdependence within that human community, like the rope that connects Sarge to Beetle Bailey. That's more of a traditional view of the end of my rope. I'm at the end of my rope, pull me up. Often the other end of our rope is held by someone, or a person, or a community of persons to hold us together in difficult times, to pull back against our hopelessness and despair, to keep us from falling into the abyss. We're not pulling the vertical rope, we're clinging to it for dear life, and we hope that it will pull us upward to safety, to sanity, to restoration of hope. And sometimes we're called to be at the other end, standing at the top of the cliff, looking down in the abyss and pulling up as hard as we can to lift that person back to solid ground. Liberal theology believes that God works in us and through us, so if we're clinging to the bottom of the rope, we are rescued by the God or the divine within the person or persons who pulls on the rope and pulls us up. And if we're at the top of the cliff, it is the divine in us and working through us that is doing the rescue work. But whether God language works for you or not, we all spend some time in our lives at one end of the vertical rope and some time at the other. So if we put the horizontal and vertical ropes in the picture, then each of us holds two ropes. The one connecting us horizontally to the others in the community, the other connecting us vertically to the sacred, however we define it. Well, in that same small group in Systematic Theology in 2001, we were talking about that triangle, which had come up in another class, and someone in the small group said, both joking and helpful, "And Jesus is the hypotenuse." That's the Barth view, that God is so distant and so other we can connect with God only through Jesus, who comes to us through the history and theology and tradition of the Christian church, as the faith tradition that's at the other end of our theological rope. When the triangle is completed, the ropes aren't quite as tight. There's a more comfortable feeling of being kind of contained. You tie it off at the three corners and live within the triangle you have either chosen or accepted. That's the appeal of traditional religion. It's one way of describing what Christians call saved. As people who have chosen a religion without a creed and with a much smaller role for Jesus, including no gospel lesson before the sermon, our openness can sometimes be perceived as an unfinished triangle. On the other hand, finishing the triangle creates an enclosure, and most of us in our love for personal freedom, that's that libertarianism, and our living tradition refuse to be contained. The natural selection process for UUs invites those who are comfortable with ambiguity, more interested in the questions than in the answers, valuing the journey more than the destination. We are those who have chosen intentionally to live our religious lives holding on to our two ropes at the corner of an incomplete triangle, leaving it open for new insights and new ideas. So I leave you today with two questions on which you may choose to reflect or not in the coming week. The first question is, who's at the other end of your horizontal rope? Your religious rope, your political rope, your gender role rope. And what can you learn or what you have learned from him or her or them? The second question is, who is or what is or who has been at the other end of your vertical rope when you need to be held and pulled upward to solid ground or when you are standing at the top of the cliff? Amen. May it be so.